The Toronto Maple Leafs have been busy in free agency, including a signing of Tyler Bertuzzi on Sunday. David Morassutti of Locked On Leafs joins us to talk about that, the draft, and all things Toronto Maple Leafs next on the Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, everybody, to the Monday edition of the Locked On NHL podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Want to thank everyone who makes Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts or on YouTube so you can get new episodes as soon as they drop. You can also find us on SiriusXM on the SXM app. Just search for Locked On NHL. It is great to have David Morassutti of Locked On Leafs back. Toronto has been busy this week between the draft and free agency. And the big news Sunday, David, Tyler Bertuzzi now going to wear the blue and white. Your thoughts about the acquisition of Bertuzzi?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those where you hear the Leafs are, among the teams interested in one of the bigger names in free agency, and you get a little skeptical of whether the Leafs can actually get it done until you see it actually put pen to paper. So, I will say it seemed like the type of player the Leafs had always intended to go out and get. What surprised me the most though is that it's a 1-year deal, because maybe I guess Bertuzzi just couldn't get that long-term deal that was out there. A lot of people felt like he needed to kind of refresh his value a little bit after a down year by many standards. He didn't exactly light the lamp last year, but he seemed to get better when he left Detroit and went to Boston. A pretty decent playoff performance for the Bruins in that round one series. So a lot to like there for the Leafs in that regard. You're not tying yourself up long term to a guy, and it just seems like the type of player the Leafs need. Not only a good top 6 contributor, but also a player that plays with that edge, which this Leafs team desperately needed, and they needed to replace with Michael Bunting leaving.
Yeah, and then, you talk about edge. Ryan Reeves also being signed. How did you feel about that, and where does he fit in, and how concerned are you about the length of the contract?
Yeah, I was not happy to see it was a 3-year deal. Like, he's 36. That's not a deal you give to a 36-year-old, especially one that's clearly a fourth liner. This felt more like a locker room type of addition than it was an on-ice edition, based on how Brad Treliving was talking about it. And to me, there's some value to having a guy like that around, but $1.3 million is not a cheap contract for a player like that, especially when you do 3 years. So I can understand why the Leafs felt like they need to make that move. It's personally not one that I thought should have been prioritized. But when you look at the moves that went and followed it, okay, at least that wasn't seen as just the only thing that they wanted to do in free agency, right? Like, the problem was that deal was done, then you heard nothing from the Leafs, and all these signings were happening, and people were just like, oh, so we just made Brian Reeves our biggest priority and nothing else was happening. So in the grand scheme of things, that deal looks a little bit different now in the eyes of Leafs fans. I still think it's too rich for the type of budget that the Leafs have to work with. They're not exactly flush with a lot of cap space, and they gave $1.3 million to Ryan Reeves, where I think you probably could have found some savings elsewhere. But a player like him usually can dictate a different type of contract because of what he brings, the toughness and things like that. Those guys have found ways to add value to their negotiations just because of what they do and what they bring.
How about John Klingberg? What were your thoughts on that acquisition?
That one surprised me. I had no inkling that the Leafs were going to be going after John Klingberg, and a lot of, especially if you look at the analyst community, they're not too high on Klingberg because defensively he's had his struggles. But it's also clear that the Leafs have desperately needed to find a way to upgrade their production from the blue line from an offensive standpoint. Their top goal scorer on the blue line from last year was Timothy Liljegren, and he didn't even play all 82 games. he wasn't a mainstay in the lineup. And so it's clear that the Leafs value the production that Klingberg has. Good skating defenseman will help with the transition game. His defensive numbers are what concern me, though. That's something that's they're going to have to really address, in my opinion, is how they're going to make that work. But a few years ago with the Dallas Stars, when he was in that improbable run to the Stanley Cup playoffs, he had 21 points in 26 games. That's elite production from the back end in the playoffs, something the Leafs just have not had in a really long time.
Were you pleased with the draft in Toronto?
I mean, the Leafs just didn't have a lot of picks, right? And so for the Leafs, they went with more like projects, players with a lot of tools and a lot of characteristics they felt like they needed to add. So yeah, this draft, they basically try to get quality because they didn't have the quantity of picks, and they're not going to have a lot of picks because of all the moves that they've made to try to win the Stanley Cup. So the Leafs are going to have to really hope that their development staff can work magics with guys like an Easton Cowan, who that was another surprise. Nobody expected him to be a first round pick. So it's been a very odd summer. It's been an unpredictable one in a lot of ways for the Leafs because nobody can really get a sense of what direction this front office is going in certain things. But I mean, the dominant conversation has always been the Stars and their next contracts. So with the draft picks, it's like you draft the guy. It's like, well, how long is he going to stick around for? Because these are the guys that are usually being traded out to bring in help now rather than help down the road.
As of right now, and we're still a couple of months away from the start of training camp, but do you feel this Leafs roster is better than where the team was at the end of last season?
They have quite a few additions that they still have to sort through. I still think that blue line needs another defenseman. Would I say they're better? I can't say that right now, just because they loaded up so much at the trade deadline that you see all these guys that left. It's like it's a lot of holes that they have to fill. I do think they added more quality. Like in past years, they've been bargain shopping in free agency, but this time around they've been adding more quality. So I think, unless we know exactly where things are, if they're going to make a trade or how they're going to make the money work with some of these other deals, I still think there's moves to be made. They're still potentially looking at getting a Max Domi. I mean, by the time this comes out, Max Domi might be a Leaf or he might sign elsewhere. I do think they need to make sure that they improve on their depth scoring. I think that's been their biggest challenge, and I'm still not convinced that they have enough of it. So I still think this is an incomplete for me right now for the Leafs. I still feel like there's a lot more that needs to be done before I can really say they've improved.
All right, David, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter at @the_Morassutti and follow the show at Locked On Leafs. And you can follow us wherever you get your podcast from and also on YouTube.
David, thank you so much. Always a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Gil.
Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Take your first swing at betting on MLB on FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets up to $200. That's right. Just bet $20 and you'll land $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. That's $200 you could spend on betting on everything from the money line to the over-under to who you think is going to hit the first home run. Met fan, Yankee fan, or a fan of any other team, you got to check out the odds at FanDuel on the app. It's all on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you can get paid instantly. There's no better place to bet on MLB than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So sign up today and visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball.